Professor Stewart Clegg. Welcome to the Trending Echoes podcast.
Thank you very much.
Welcome to Trends and welcome to Abu Dhabi.
Yes.
It's your first time?
No, it's not my first time. It's probably about the third time in Abu Dhabi, and in the UAE probably the 7th or 8th, 9th time. I used to come, I had a colleague at the British University in Dubai, and I would often spend a weekend here and do some seminars for the students and do some research teaching.
And how do you find that the research ecosystem here has developed between your first and your current visits?
I don't think I've got enough insight to be able to say much about that. I should have some more insight after tomorrow, because I'll be talking to a group at the Rabdan about how to do research and get published. So I'll have a better idea about it then. So if you could, ask me this question in 24 hours, I could give you a much better answer.
Yeah, indeed. Well, it's tertiary education here is definitely a very dynamic sector and a key focus. So it is year to year, it is quite clear to see tangible developments. So it's an interesting phenomenon to witness. I'm sure with the next visit you come, you'll be able to see some quite noticeable changes. But Professor, I wanted to start off by saying it turns out we actually have a fair bit in common. Both born in the UK, emigrated to Australia some time ago, both ended up at University of Sydney, where you are now Professor in the Department of Project Management in the Faculty of Engineering. And here we are in Abu Dhabi talking about artificial intelligence and management education, which is the topic of today's podcast. But that's where the common ground ends, because unlike myself, you have multiple decades of experience at the top tiers of research, very interdisciplinary and multidisciplinary research, but focusing on sociology and organisational theory. And that experience is what I'm looking forward to tapping into today.
Sure.
Very much. But in terms of your journey, en route to Sydney University, if I'm not wrong, it was quite a journey. So appointments in Norway, Portugal, Denmark, St Andrews in Scotland, University of Cambridge, and then multiple roles at several of Australia's leading universities.
Yeah, well, some of those were visiting appointments, but I migrated to Australia in 1976 because in that year the British economy had one of its periodic crises. The International Monetary Fund intervened. They loaned the government £3.5 billion and said that you have to cut public spending. It's when monetarism first was introduced. So I was just coming off a postgraduate postdoc, and the jobs were disappearing. So I got a cable one day asking me if I was interested in a job as a lecturer in sociology at a new university in Brisbane called Griffith University, and it was reply paid, so I said yes, and that's how I came to be in Australia. So I spent about 8 years at Griffith University and had a very, very creative and engaging time. I was in an interdisciplinary school of humanities, working with people from disciplines I'd never encountered before and trying to construct conversations across boundaries. It was a very, very exciting period, and I think I learned a lot from that period. Then I was invited to become Professor of Sociology at the University of New England, and I stayed there for 5 years. New England, Armidale, it's a nice place, but it's a small place. It's you don't get a lot of cosmopolitanism in a place like that, and I had itchy feet. I got invited to become a professor at the University of St Andrews. The person who was the external examiner for the School of Management there was in Armidale, and I was hosting him, and he said, would you be interested in coming back to the UK and taking up a chair at St Andrews? So I was very honoured by that, because St Andrews is this very old and top British university. I didn't really enjoy my time there that much. I thought that having lived in a northern New England climate, that I'd adapt quickly to the Scottish climate, but that was not the case, nor to the cultural climate. It seemed very monocultural after living in Australia and being part of Australia. So I spent about 3.5 years there, and I was pretty keen to come home, because I really realised, living in the UK for the second time in my life, living in Scotland, that Australia was where I felt was home. So eventually I did come back. I became Foundation Professor of Management at what's now called Western Sydney University. I spent about 3.5 years there as well. And then I was asked to become Professor at the University of Technology. They were in the business school, in the Department of Management, and I was given a brief. The brief was to help to cultivate a research culture in a school which had been primarily oriented towards teaching. And so for the next 20-odd years, probably for too long, I think it does you good to move jobs every now and then. I think I stayed too long in one place. And then during COVID, when I had to teach online, and which I didn't enjoy very much, I ended up doing a job which was basically like being a casual tutor, because I was just tutoring first-year students online, and it really wasn't very, very engaging. The university was facing some fiscal problems as a result of COVID, and they introduced a voluntary redundancy scheme. So having a long period of service, I had quite an attractive proposition in front of me. So I thought, right, I'll take the scheme. I'll retire, and goodness knows what I'll do next. I'll probably keep on doing what I do. And on the day that I left that university, I got an email asking me if I would be interested in helping to establish a new school of project management at the University of Sydney. So I kind of fell on my feet, really, and I'm really enjoying working there. I have great colleagues. It's a great university, and it's very good. I hope I can continue to do so for as long as possible.
Well, I mean, that...
Oh, and in between that, yes, I did have visiting appointments I was the Monte Mazzolo visiting professor in Cambridge. I've been visiting professor in Norway, Denmark, France, Portugal, America, Canada, New Zealand, Hong Kong. I probably missed a few out. So, yes, fairly global.
Well, one of the perks of academia for many often seems to be that it's quite a direct route to a pretty healthy frequent flyer points balance. So it seems you're definitely a leading exemplar of that. But,
depends on the institution.
Exactly, that's very true. But you've picked many great ones. I mean, for instance, Griffith, you said you jumped on board there right at the early doors, but that's gone on to become a very top-notch university, doing great things. UTS, similarly. And I'm sure with the nascent, are we still calling it nascent School of Project Management at Sydney University, or is it? No,
it's probably born, and it's in its early years. It is, I think, or we think in the school, we think we're probably the only school of project management that's a standalone entity globally. So we're really becoming very much a focus of all the management scholars who are interested in temporary organising and projects. So we're becoming very much a home for that, and building up a healthy research profile, which I'm helping to contribute to.
Why do you think that is the case, that it's the only standalone one in existence? It would seem to be a good candidate for that sort of standalone.
Well, project management tends to be one of those things which either emerged out of subcivil engineering and is still. We're in an engineering faculty, or it's taught as a substratum of in a business school. So we're probably we cover the whole compass of projects. So innovation projects, sustainability projects, construction infrastructure projects. The focus is on temporary organisations that are established with a very different, a very distinct goal in mind, and looking at the ways in which they may achieve it. it's a great time to be working in this space because the number of major infrastructure projects globally is rapidly increasing at the present time. There was a recent Harvard Business Review paper in which the professor, whose name I can't remember, said that projects were becoming really the hallmark of organizing in the 21st century. So, it's great to be dealing with something that's alive and expanding and exciting.
And do you feel, you mentioned just before in your sort of summary of your journey that you felt, well, you were very aware of sort of the monoculturalism when you were at St Andrews versus when you've been teaching and working in Australia.
Yeah.
Do you find that the more, I guess, multicultural focus or presence in Australian environments in that sense, at least in your experience, tends to lead or encourage more of an interdisciplinary type approach and mindset to academia? And is that something you're really looking forward to taking forward with this new school?
Absolutely. The great thing about Australia is that so many of us are hybrid Australians. We're Anglo-Australians, we're Irish Australians, we're Emirati Australians. We're Australians from all over the world. And I think that that potpourri of cultural influences, of intellectual traditions and skills is really important. I think it's one of the things that gives the place its joie de vivre and the vibrancy of its everyday life. And you certainly find that reflected in a school such as ours. I work with colleagues, quite a number of whom are from the Middle East, several of whom are from China, some of whom, one or two of whom are Australian, and scholars from Pakistan, India, and just America. It's very, very. It's very rich. Every one of us is tapping into different sorts of things, so that when we're actually working together, the sum of us is more than any of the individuals could contribute.
And as I take it, you're not just a man of interdisciplinary focus, you're also quite a multifaceted individual in the sense of, if I'm not wrong, you have quite a penchant for jazz music in your spare time.
Well, I have jazz, and I used to be an announcer on Radio 4ZZZ in Brisbane. I was the jazz announcer. I had another program, a program called the American Music Program with a colleague, Philip. We used to do. I gave it up when the demands of scholarship just became too much, but I did that for about a year and a half, something like that, and I really enjoyed it. The other reason I gave it up was that the record library that 4ZZZ had didn't have a lot of jazz records in it, and I just about got through most of the ones that I owned at that stage. I used to do features on particular artists, largely because my collection was skewed heavily towards sort of Miles Davis and Thelonious Monk and Charlie Parker, John Coltrane, Billie Holiday, all the greats. So and the other great thing was if you used someone like Coltrane, you could put on Coltrane improvising around my favourite things, and that was 15 minutes of programming already taken care of. So yeah, no, I have a lively interest in film, in cinema, in drama. I try to read histories a lot. I find reading histories very stimulating, and latterly, I've discovered that if you go to, there's a shop in Canberra called Lifeline, which is a charity shop. And it's a wonderful repository of music because widows get rid of their husbands' LP collections and CD collections, and they sell these LPs for $1 and the CDs for $2. So mostly classical music. So I've really expanded my horizons of classical music too. So I've been dipping into Bartók and Shostakovich, which is outside of the sort of classical repertoire that I would normally have known beforehand.
Well, it's interesting you bring up Shostakovich. Often, if I'm thinking of bringing this back to the AI dimension, when you think of Shostakovich, it's often not the most traditionally melodic music, but it's quite focused on particular sort of rhythmic nuances or almost mathematical. I mean, all music is maths, obviously, but particularly so in the case of Shostakovich with the sort of the less traditional, often more jarring combinations of notes, therefore numbers, and it makes you think. Taking music in that sense away from the traditional human understanding of harmony and what sounds typically quote unquote nice. Where could AI then fit into, for instance, producing that sort of or engaging in that sort of composition rather?
Yeah. Well, yeah, I mean, you could ask AI to write a symphony like Beethoven, for instance, but it wouldn't be Beethoven. It would be some awful pastiche and facsimile, I'm absolutely sure. Or solo like John Coltrane. I don't think so. I think these are what make people great. I mean, you listen to John Coltrane playing a trite little musical show song like My Favorite Things, and he takes it to a transcendent zone. It's just wonderful, wonderful stuff.
So as a jazz man, you're not we're not having too many sleepless nights about the thought of AI producing a West Coast jazz standard that Dave Brubeck would be jealous of.
No, I don't think so. I think that's unlikely. I mean, there's enough contemporary popular music which sounds like it was produced by AI that, I mean, every time I go into a cafe, it's often playing and, it sounds terrible. It's just, if you like real music, it's not really real music. It's very much machine-made music. And a lot of popular music is like that today, which it's fine. I mean, it's what young people like. So.
Well, in terms of the specific topic of today's episode, so artificial intelligence and management education, just to bring the listeners up to speed and get everyone on the same page, could you maybe just clarify what you are defining as management education here, but also the importance, the relevance of the connection between that and artificial intelligence?
Sure. AI is making a huge impact. I mean, it's not been around for very long, but it's created a great deal of ferment. And you notice this particularly in at least two critical contexts. One is the sort of almost moral panic in universities about students submitting papers that may have been written by artificial intelligence, and how do we know and what do we do? How do we deal with it? And then secondly, many journal editors have been promulgating policies and practices which they would not have been doing if AI had not emerged on the scene. And in each case, the core concern is with being able to discriminate between that which is produced by a machine and that which is produced by the human subject. We don't want our engineers and our doctors and our nurses going into the workplace because they knew how to ask artificial intelligence questions that got them degrees. We want them to have actually distilled and instilled a human intelligence which will enable them to react to unanticipated or unexpected situations, to be creative, to be imaginative. So the key concern is the extent to which AI can be used in such a way that it engages that creativity and imagination rather than replacing it.
And you and your co-author, Professor Somadeep Sarkar, recently published a journal article on this very topic in the International Journal of Management Education. Would you be able to give the listeners a brief layman's description of how you went about tackling the topic, the problem that you've taken on in the paper?
Sure. Well, it's very interesting. Somadeep and I have worked on a number of collaborations over the years, beginning with a paper about cork, a staple of the Portuguese economy where he works in Portugal. And the cork industry nearly disappeared in Portugal when people stopped putting cork in the top of bottles and went on to screw caps. So that was our first collaboration. Simodip's very interested in ANLP models, and he was able to write some of the more technical aspects of the paper. I'm very interested in the broader conception of management, so we pooled our skills in doing this. The paper went through many iterations. The paper that I gave today was not the paper that the last time I presented this paper was about a year or so ago at a seminar at Sydney Uni, and it was a very different paper. I'd couched the discussion of it in terms of Foucault and Foucault's technologies of modernity. Well, all of that disappeared in the final draft of the paper. I decided, given the editorial advice we received, that the thing to do was to try and make it very, very focused on practical issues. So the practical issues came down to, in a word, I would probably say the relationship between machine intelligence and human intelligence as sense-making. So I wanted to be able to try to discriminate some of the different ways in which machine intelligence could be used as an adjunct to, as an artifact of human intelligence and managerial sense-making, and sense-making in the education process as well.
And now, while the article is about AI and management education, specifically, what I took from reading it is that the findings seem to be very generalizable across many fields. Given that, if I'm not wrong, what would you say are the most important of those generalizable findings from the piece that can be applied across academia and knowledge formation more broadly?
I think that the most important finding is probably we have to have a degree of realism about artificial intelligence as a social fact. I mean, it's there, it exists, it's not going to go away. So the crucial thing becomes, how do we use it? How do we deal with it? How do we use it in such a way that we can still point to the contributions that are made by human intelligence utilizing machine intelligence as an artifact and as a device to do things that we would not otherwise do. So the crucial thing is to try and think of ways, and I'll use the educational context first, so to try and think of ways in which students could be trained in using artificial intelligence, not to produce papers which they've had no agency in producing, and a lot of that does go on. I can tell you that it's fairly public knowledge that the universities are very, very worried about the effect of AI, because the traditional mode of essay writing is so open to being substituted by the machine writing rather than the human writing. So how do we begin to devise curriculum and pedagogic practices which don't allow the students to cheat, in a very simple word? Well, one of the things we can do is to urge that when students are addressing a particular problem topic that they're set, that they make very clear what prompts they've used for accessing machine intelligence, because the quality of the prompts may well have a lot to do with the quality of the knowledge that they produce. Secondly, we should take the output that is machine generated not as a thing in itself, but as an opportunity for further reflection. So I would see that if a student were to produce a machine-generated paper to a specific topic that I had set, I would want them to be able to write a critical reflexive essay on the ways in which the machine script had been not been produced, but what the product was. How did the product stack up against the lively intelligence that a well-read student would and should have on the topic in question? So it still retains the important element of learning, which is a crucial thing, because asking a machine to produce something for you is not learning. Learning is about knowing, doing, embedding, embraining. It's about the use of the creative intelligence. So I think it's very important to be able to make those distinctions. Now, those distinctions are particularly heightened in university education because we want to know that it's the student who's learning something, not the student who's learning how to press a few buttons and get the machine to do the work for them. But it equally has implications in the wider world. We want to be sure that when managers are relying on artificial intelligence for making important strategic decisions, for instance, that they're doing so with a sufficient knowledge and depth and grasp of strategy as a practice that they're able to be critical about what it is that the machine intelligence might produce.
This ability to be critical, to deploy critical thinking, to me it seems, and at least from reading the article, as you and your co-author suggest, it is not a polemic proposing that, for instance, GPT-4 shouldn't be used, generative AI shouldn't be used to help and grease the wheels of the research process and the writing process. And indeed, I think you say, writing and analysis can be or should be sufficiently aided by generative AI. But then bringing this back to either maintaining or developing the ability for critical thinking, do you think, or do you not see there's potentially somewhat of a catch-22 there, in the sense of, if generative AI is promoted through and used extensively by students and promoted by their teachers for being used through that writing and analysis process, that the ability for developing critical thinking would not wither away, because writing, producing good writing, is one of the foremost illustrations of critical thought there is. And if we delegate more and more of the writing and we delegate more and more of the analysis, would we then forego the opportunities through an education process for younger people to develop that critical thinking?
Well, I mentioned that about a year ago I'd presented a version of the paper quite different from the one that was published at Sydney University. And one of the arguments that I made in that paper, I think it was in response to a question, was that I felt that one impact of AI would be that we would have to return to invigilated examinations. Because I think it's precisely in the invigilated examination when you can actually get the metal of what the person's learnt. Now, the student members of the audience weren't very happy to hear that. I don't think they liked the idea of being asked to sit in an exam room for 3 hours and write it all down. But short of doing that, I'm not sure how I could safely answer your question. I think that if we were to return to some traditional practices and to combine them with the affordances that AI has, then we could be reasonably sure that that critical faculty didn't wither, because that critical faculty will be required to, if it's a good exam, I mean a good exam in terms of questions that demand ingenuity, creativity and knowing to answer, and to do it in under pressure in a short period of time, then I think that would be an important consideration. So I think, along with the very progressive elements of the argument, there may well be some elements of the argument implicitly which people may not regard as being quite so progressive. I think there's something to be said for going back to the old technique of the examination as a technology.
So in that sense, I would say that if that were to be the case moving forward, then more and more onus and responsibility we put upon the individual student to, given the fact that study happens at home primarily, in a personal individual setting, the onus becomes more and more the individual to, I guess, develop a maturity for approaching their studies that and a responsibility that may not have been there, I guess, historically, or been pressured to be there in that sense historically. And in that sense, it seems like there'd be more and more of a role of the parents and the household in the education process moving forwards, as opposed to delegating it largely to the teachers, because so much of success in education, given what you mentioned about, for instance, bringing back invigilated exams, there's nothing the teacher can do about ensuring that the essay project they give their students to do at home is or is not going to be done.
I don't think there's nothing. I mean, I think we can. I think we can educate the educators to be able to discern the extent to which textual material that they're reading has been produced on a machine basis as opposed to a human basis. I've had a couple of students who've submitted as part of assignments to me texts that I could tell instantly that this was not written by them. The level of English was, it was more fluent than they would produce. That was the first thing. Secondly, it had some vocabulary that I would not expect. And thirdly, and this was the real giveaway, points were very general, sometimes trite and not referenced. And that, I think, was important. I mean, we can educate the educators to see that they're not being hoodwinked, and it's important to do that. Yeah. Look, you can't blame students for wanting to try and cut corners, but in the interests of their education as individuals, our interests collectively as societies in knowing that we're dealing with knowledgeable, skilled and professional people when we're going to the doctor or we're building bridges or we're entering into businesses. We want to know that these are people who really do know what they're doing. They're not just ventriloquists. And we have to make sure that we structure the education process in such a way that we don't allow ventriloquism to become its dominant practice.
Something else which indeed you brought up just before in the talk that you gave here at Trends, and something that you allude to with your co-author in the paper, as I remember, is the prospect of generative AI in the research world raising the floor of the general standard of academic writing, because, as we've touched on, and as you just mentioned before, generative AI produces a level of fluency in basic prose that often isn't there prior. But tying that to the point I made before about to what extent would delegating more and more of our work to generative AI through the writing and analysis side of things at least diminish the capacity for critical thinking, critical thought. Given those two premises, if indeed you accept them, do you feel that let's say the bell curve of the standard of academic writing is going to have a fatter middle? There's just going to be a lot of it's a larger convergence around a semi-decent standard. There won't be horrific examples, but there'll be less and less very top-class, innovative, critical examples.
No, I don't think so. Well. I mean, I had a colleague many years ago, and he pointed out to me that about 90% of what gets to be published in the journals is contributed by about 10% of the academics engaged. I met him later, a few years later, and he said, I'd like to revise that. He said, I think it's probably a lower percentage than 10%. I mean, there are, you just have to look at H indexes and things like that. Some people are widely read and some people are never read at all. I mean, the average citation, I was once told, and I don't know whether this is true, is about one for an article. So, yeah, maybe your mum reads it, or my mum's never read anything I wrote. My mum's dead now, but she never read anything I wrote, nor did Dad. To go back to the question. Let's think about it as a process. We want to look at the prompts that the student has used to ask questions of machine intelligence. We want to look at the output that the machine produces. We then want to see what difference the student makes in their version of what the machine produces to what the machine produces. So as I said earlier, one of the characteristics of the machine-produced prose is that sometimes it's at a very general level. This, of course, could change as the technology becomes more refined. And secondly, it tends to be sort of reference light. So what I would really be looking for would be an evolutionary process. I'd want to look at the process whereby a final product in which there was unequivocal human intelligence input used the affordances that machine intelligence can produce.
So optimistic.
Yeah, I think we have to be. I mean, I said at the outset, it's a social fact. It exists. It's there. It's not going to go away. We have to have some guardrails. We have to try and police it in some ways, but we're not going to prohibit it. We have to be very, very careful that we move into. I mean, if I've written a lot about the modern world and the postmodern world in the past. I mean, I think artificial intelligence is a real reach into a postmodern world because it's a world in which text is not necessarily produced by human subjects. It can be produced by machines. And this is a very, very novel phenomena. We're only a couple of years really into this phenomena. There's been intimations of it for about 60 years, but we're only really into it as a practical development in the last two and a half years. So we're at a very early stage. I think it's important, being at that early stage, that we try to find some ways of ensuring that we don't get hoodwinked or outfoxed by the artificial intelligence that we produce, that we use.
Sure.
We don't produce it.
Changing tacts slightly, as become very clear throughout our talk today, you're a man with many interests, and indeed someone who is obviously and continues to connect the dots across different fields and different interests in the pursuit of generating understanding and knowledge. And if I'm not wrong, this is largely how you came up with your renowned model, the Circuits of Power framework. Your knowledge, your love of music, and therefore your extensive time around stereo sets, and therefore knowledge of circuit boards. That knowledge and experience you had, and you used to use the model, the image of a circuit board to draw inspiration for your frameworks for power.
It was actually the other way around, and machine intelligence had a lot to do with it. I was a visiting professor at the University of Otago in 1988, one of the southernmost universities in the world, in the bottom of New Zealand. And there was a Mac lab, and I was making the transition from writing with a 2B pencil to using a computer. It was an early user. And I found this program on this very old Mac, which you floppy disks into to work with, called Mac Draw. And I was trying to visualize what I was thinking. And I used the Mac Draw program to visualize what I was thinking. And when I'd visualized what I was thinking, I thought it looks like a circuit diagram. And that's how it became circuits of power. It wasn't that I thought circuits of power in the first place. It was the visualization of the processes that I was trying to encapsulate textually, which led me to think of it as a circuits of power model.
And, well, as part of that, as I remember it, the circuits of power framework, there is existence of, as you coin it, obligatory passage points.
Yeah.
Which, to use the metaphor roughly, the circuit board are like switches that can change how power can move and transfer and interchange between circuits. As I was thinking about that, and then in the context of our talk and artificial intelligence, I was wondering, does AI fit more into being the switch, or does it fit more into being a dynamic that works within a circuit, or both? And how do you see that? Maybe just for the listeners, if you can very briefly give a description of your framework and the different components of it.
Well, the framework's very, very, I was going to say it's very simple, but it's probably not. It's very simple to me. Basically, traditionally, political science had a definition of power relations as an A getting a B to do something that a B wouldn't otherwise do. I was, some of the reading that I had done and I was very interested in was in what's known as realism, the realist theory of science. And I began to think that you can only get things. If you think about laboratory science is not a mirror of the world. It's an artificial environment. So you create artificial conditions, standing conditions in the laboratory, which ensure that when you do A, B will happen in consequence. You have a sterile test tube, you have the right proportion of chemicals and distilled water and so on. And I thought, well, that's a little bit like everyday life, because we're all of us practical experimentalists in everyday life. We're striving to achieve purpose and to achieve ends. So the standing conditions are really important, the standing conditions which enable an A to get a B to do something they wouldn't otherwise do. And then I began to think, well, that's not all of what power's about. I mean, power doesn't just depend upon people doing things to others. It often, for instance, I was very familiar with debates in political science that in the community power debate, which had suggested that non-decision making was just as important as decision making, that non-issues were just as important as issues. So that, you know, if you have a situation, a hypothetical, you have a hypothetical global media organization, let's call it News Corp, and you have a hypothetical chairman of News Corp, let's call him Rupert Murdoch. And Rupert Murdoch isn't on the phone telling his editors what to do globally every day. They know damn well what they have to do globally every day. They know what the issues are, and they know what the non-issues are. And so Murdoch doesn't have to, the hypothetical Rupert Murdoch doesn't have to exercise power in that sort of push-pull stimulus-response way in which the A-B model suggests. The non-issues and the non-decision-making are inscribed into the consciousness of those who are familiar with the processes which are going on. So I thought, well, yes, there's an important role for dispositions here. And then I also thought about the importance of innovation, of exogenous. I think I called it exogenous environmental contingencies could create technological innovations. But I was not only interested in technological innovations. I said earlier that I like reading histories, and one of the histories that I read is in my 20s was the transition from feudalism to capitalism by a man called Perry Anderson. And he makes a very, very important point that one of the major factors in facilitating that transition was the effect of the Black Death, the plague in the 14th century, because it weakened the feudal power of the nobles and gave them less control over the serfs, who, because there were less of them, they were able to strike better bargains and were also able to flee serfdom and establish themselves in the interstices of a mercantile economy that was beginning to emerge. So I thought, exogenous environmental contingencies could include the rat, the Norwegian rat, which spread the plague, or the flea that lived on the rat. And so I became very interested in how non-human actants could create major changes, which I revisited recently because I was not surprised by the pandemic. I mean, in a sense, the Black Death, my understanding of the plague and the effect that the virus had, already prepared me to write about COVID, which I've done on a number of occasions. So, I thought about three circuits of power: the exercise of power, where you get the standing conditions right, the structuring of the dispositions of the subjects, and then thirdly the technologies, the everyday technologies of organizing, of doing things, and the fact that the unanticipated will always happen, events will always occur. If I'd written frameworks today, I probably would have just called them events, actually. I remember the British Prime Minister, Harold Macmillan, was once asked by Jacob Rees-Mogg's father what he worried him most in politics, and Macmillan replied, "Events, dear boy, events." And this was, I think, about the time that the Profumo incident had occurred, and the Profumo events had occurred. And events are very important because it's events which actually... It's when events occur that we don't know how to make sense of them. We're not sure what they are. We haven't got any categories for them. That's when human intelligence becomes really, really critical and important. You couldn't use machine intelligence to provide an answer to an event which had just happened that you didn't understand, because it wouldn't have anything on which it could base a predictive answer.
So in that sense, AI wouldn't be one of the switches. It wouldn't be an obligatory passage point. It would, those passage points would be the ability of the individual, the group, to use a tool like AI as part of their sense-making process, but they are the ones making the sense, and therefore that causes or enables the switch and the transfer of power.
Well, I would probably prefer to say that if you really wanted to know how to deal with an unexpected event like COVID-19 was, you probably would have been better reading history than asking a machine intelligence. If you had some idea of... read some of the work on epidemics. There's a wonderful book by a man called, I think it's Snowden, that I read on the history of epidemics. And certainly if you were a policymaker and you read that book, you wouldn't have made some of the errors that were made by policymakers during the early stages of the pandemic.
Just to wrap things up, as I'm conscious of your time, just bringing things back to that point about, for instance, your background of multifaceted background and how that manifested to help with the formation of this framework, the circuits of power. Do you fear that in an age where young people's lives particularly manifest primarily through a phone screen, and that people may develop less and less with the diversity of experiences and the diversity of skill sets across a variety of analog pursuits? You mentioned, for instance, in your background with the musical side of things. a variety and a diversity that is necessary to be able to connect the dots in ways to form new understanding in the way that you did with your appropriation of circuit boards. Do you feel that is a risk with, or in the age of that we are now in, with the extent to which so many of our lives, particularly through our sort of formative and development eras or parts of our lives, manifest through a phone screen and through, for instance, now delegating questions to generative AI?
Yeah. It's a risk. I mean, clearly the worst excesses of the TikTok generation might lead you to think that. But on the other hand, one of the things that one of the routines which is very important to me is that every day I start my day reading The Guardian, the Sydney Morning Herald, the FT, the Daily Telegraph, the Economist, and I do it all on my little handheld device. So it's important how you use the technologies that are available to you. You can spend a lot of time playing games on them, and game playing can itself be a very important skill. It can sharpen the reflexes in lots of ways, which are very, very useful for all sorts of pursuits. There are events happening not so far from us here, across the water, in which an ability to be able to be a sharp video operator would make the difference between whether something lands where you want it to land or it doesn't land where you want it to land. So, I wouldn't want to make prohibitive statements. The most important thing is to have a rich, complex life. And I think travel, exposure to different cultures, reading, and reading widely are all really important things in producing this. Max Weber, at the end of his book on the Protestant ethic and the spirit of capitalism, worried that we were becoming sensualists without spirit, becoming little cogs in machines, desperately desiring to be bigger cogs in the machines. Well, I think that's not the case. I mean, that might have been the case when bureaucracy was king, when Weber was writing it. The Prussian bureaucracy was the context in which he wrote. But today we have so many more creative ways of organizing and of doing things. And in this postmodern world, I think it's the creative intelligences which will flourish rather than the people who are very narrowly focused on one thing. So I think the importance is lead a good life, lead a rich life, and cram in as many experiences and as much good music and film and theatre and books as you can.
And a bit of jazz along the way too.
And accompany it with jazz. I mean, that's really the crucial thing. I told somebody once that they were amused that when I write, I'm always listening to music, partly because I have a ringing in my ear and it's kind of titinous, and and it helps mask that. And when I'm listening to Thelonious Monk in particular, I find that my typing becomes more choppy. So the rhythm of the music can affect the rhythm of the mind.
Well, seems very profound and very applicable to anyone listening. Useful advice to end the episode on. So, Professor, thank you very much for your time today. And would you like to?
Well, thank you very much for having me here at Trending Echoes podcast. It's been great talking to you, Miguel. I really, really appreciate it. And as a fellow Australian as well, that makes it even nicer. So thank you very much indeed.
It's lovely how life comes full circle sometimes. So it's been a pleasure, Professor, and look forward to welcoming you back here in the future.
I hope so, very much so.
All the best, and good luck with the newish School of Project Management at Sydney University.
Thank you very much indeed.
All the best.